It was one of those New York evenings where the rain seemed determined to make itself heard. Each droplet tapped against the window of our modest Brooklyn apartment, creating a rhythm both soothing and insistent, as if the city itself refused to be ignored. The apartment, small by most standards, was a place I had come to consider a cocoon from the roar of sirens, subways, and endless streams of people outside. In that sense, it was my refuge, even when the world beyond my walls felt so overwhelming. Inside, the glow of a single floor lamp painted the walls in a soft, honeyed hue. The simple furnishings, an old love seat we'd found at a thrift store, a makeshift coffee table fashioned from a repurposed trunk, and bookcases overflowing with texts, reflected our combined effort to make the most of what little space we had. My roommate, Olivia, and I had been living here for almost 2 years, and in that time, we'd built a life filled with comforting routines and personal quirks. Photographs pinned to corkboards showcased our shared history, snapshots of us laughing at a summer street fair, or at a Yankees game we'd attended on a whim, or just standing around the city, arms draped around each other, grinning. I'd often joke that the apartment smelled perpetually of coffee. It might have been because I was somewhat addicted, constantly brewing fresh pots from a battered French press that my parents had passed down to me when I started college. The aroma had seeped into the curtains, the cushions, and even, I suspected, the walls themselves. It was comforting, a steady presence that reminded me I was in a place I could call home. There was something about Olivia that contrasted with all that routine. If my side of the living room was tidy and minimalist, lined with textbooks on graphic design and neatly stacked notebooks, hers was the opposite. An explosion of color, half-finished canvases from her painting hobby, and an overflowing basket of yarn for crocheting projects she started but rarely finished. She had a restless spirit, one that I had always admired yet found slightly unsettling. Her untamed energy was a whirlwind to my sense of order. I first met Olivia in a dormitory lounge at NYU, where we were both attending undergrad. We bonded over late-night ramen and the shared complaint that the radiators in the building never seemed to work. We discovered we both loved music. She adored live jazz bars in Manhattan, while I preferred indie gigs in the Lower East Side. When we decided to become roommates, I figured it was a perfect match. Her spontaneity might pull me out of my comfort zone, and my structure could help her keep her chaotic brilliance somewhat anchored. Still, as the months turned into years, subtle tensions occasionally arose. She was the type to stay out late, returning at odd hours, singing off-key in the hallway before stumbling into the apartment. I valued my nights in, my schedules, my bullet point lists. Yet, ironically, that very unpredictability in her was also what made her captivating to be around. She had a way of bringing light into any room she entered, even if it was midnight and she'd just woken up from a nap. Sometimes, I caught her studying me in this quiet, curious way, as though she wanted to tell me something important, but couldn't quite put it into words. I never asked her about it. Perhaps I was too afraid to hear what she might say. I'd push the feeling aside, drowning any rogue thoughts with more coffee or diving back into my design projects. Our routines hummed along as usual, her unpredictability meshing, oddly enough, with my desire for stability. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. That was before everything changed on that one stormy night, when I discovered the line between friend and something more could be crossed so abruptly. I never imagined such a simple, impulsive moment could upend my life so completely. It all started with the smallest shift, like noticing a tiny crack in a window you'd never paid attention to before. The day it first struck me that I was watching Olivia a bit too closely, we were curled up on the couch together. The battered love seat was just big enough for 2 people if they didn't mind bumping elbows or tangling feet. She was introducing me to one of her beloved classics, some black and white film from the 1940s, full of dramatic lighting and old Hollywood glamour. The softness of the television's glow cast delicate shadows on her face, accentuating the curve of her cheekbones and reflecting in her large, expressive eyes. I remember her lips were parted in a grin, her laughter dancing through the living room each time something comedic happened on screen. Olivia's laughter was loud and unrestrained, the kind that caused her entire body to shake. I thought I was being subtle, stealing fleeting glances in her direction, but suddenly she hit pause. The television froze on some mid-century actress's overly dramatic expression. Olivia turned to me with a mischievous sparkle in her eyes. "You're staring," she said, her tone teasing, yet oddly gentle. It felt like she was acknowledging something bigger than the moment suggested. My face flared with heat, and I tried to pretend I didn't understand. "No, I'm not," I replied, forcing a laugh. I zoned out. She let her gaze linger on me for a second longer than usual, and in that brief interval, my heart hammered so loudly I was convinced she could hear it. "Sure," she said, drawing out the syllable as though unconvinced, but she clicked play again, returning her attention to the movie. Meanwhile, my thoughts churned. Why had I been staring? And more importantly, why did it feel like I'd been caught doing something I wasn't supposed to? Over the next several days, I found myself noticing all kinds of minute details about Olivia. Things that surely had been there all along, but that I suddenly couldn't ignore. Like the aroma of her perfume, a sweet floral scent that seemed to float in the air for a moment after she passed by. Or the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating on a painting. Little traits that weren't special in themselves, but that seemed to etch themselves more deeply into my awareness. Sometimes I hated myself for noticing so much, for letting my mind wander to places I wasn't sure it should go. I knew I wasn't oblivious to my own emotional complexity. Growing up, I'd had crushes on boys and fleeting interests in girls, but I'd always brushed them aside, telling myself that it was just a phase or a curiosity. My life, up to this point, had been too focused on achieving academic goals to leave room for introspection. Now, with Olivia constantly in my immediate environment, I felt those dormant questions rising again, no longer content to remain suppressed. What made it more complicated was the fear that if these feelings weren't mutual, or if I misread some boundary, our entire friendship could be ruined. The thought of losing her as a friend, or as the comforting presence in my daily life, terrified me more than confronting my own murky emotions. Late at night, I'd lie awake in bed, staring at the glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds, replaying these small, seemingly insignificant moments in my head. Her laughter, her teasing remark, the warmth in her expression when she looked at me. I'd ask myself, am I making this up? Imagining a spark that isn't there? The idea that Olivia might sense my mounting confusion and retreat from me felt crushing. But as the days passed, I started to think maybe I wasn't imagining it. There were instances where her hand would brush mine when we reached for the same dish in the cupboard, and I'd feel a jolt of awareness. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me with the same intensity that had overwhelmed me on the couch that night. A subtle tension began to buzz in the spaces between our interactions, like static electricity that crackled in the air whenever we were near each other. That tension scared me. But under the fear, there was something else, a thrill of possibility. And that was perhaps the most frightening part of all. It happened so suddenly, I didn't have time to prepare for how it would change everything. It was a late night, so late that the street outside had quieted to a rare hush, as if even New York's perpetual hum had dimmed. A gentle drizzle tapped against the windows, creating a lullaby of soft percussion that harmonized with the low croon of Lana Del Rey playing from Olivia's phone speakers. I was sprawled on the couch, half lost in thought, while Olivia cleaned up the kitchen. The overhead light in the living room was switched off, leaving the space lit only by a small lamp perched on a side table and the flicker of passing headlights through the blinds. I recall reading something for class, though I couldn't tell you what it was. My mind was too saturated with that ever-present awareness of her. At some point, Olivia finished in the kitchen and drifted over to where I lay, settling herself so close that the warmth of her body reached me. I glanced up, meeting her eyes, and felt a flicker of concern in her expression. Nervousness, maybe even determination. "Hey," she said softly. "Can I ask you something?" My mouth felt inexplicably dry. I closed my laptop and sat up, heart pounding. "Sure," I replied, though I had no idea what she was going to say. She opened her mouth, but nothing emerged. Instead, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to mine. In that moment, it was as though the entire world tilted. All the atmospheric tension I'd been sensing for days, or perhaps longer, erupted in a wave of sensation that took my breath away. Her lips were soft, gentle, yet firm, and an immediate warmth spread through my body. My mind spun with 100 thoughts, each colliding with the next. Is this really happening? Why now? What do I do? I froze. Not because I wanted it to end, but because shock had locked my limbs. Time stretched. The raindrops outside, the hum of the music, and even the glow of the lamp seemed to fade into a dim haze. All that remained was the taste of Olivia's lips and the thunderous pounding of my heart. Then, just as suddenly, she pulled back, her eyes wide with alarm. She looked as startled as I felt. "I'm sorry," she blurted, her voice trembling. I didn't know how else to..." She didn't finish her sentence. She didn't need to. The room filled with a deafening silence as I tried to process what had just happened. A breath caught in my throat, and my heart refused to settle into a normal rhythm. "It's okay," I finally managed, though the words sounded hollow to my own ears. I wasn't sure if it was okay. I didn't know if I was supposed to be upset or relieved. All I knew was that my entire reality had just shifted. Olivia searched my face, uncertainty etched into her features. But I was too overwhelmed to offer her any reassurance. Without another word, she stood up and disappeared into her bedroom, leaving me alone in the living room, mouth still tingling from the unexpected kiss. In the days that followed, the apartment felt like a silent battleground. The invisible lines we had once comfortably navigated in our daily lives now loomed like gaping chasms. Our once effortless conversations became stilted, awkward. Instead of lingering together over morning coffee, we took turns. If I woke up first, I would make my coffee, gulp it down, and rush out the door before Olivia emerged from her room. If she woke up first, she did the same. We practically tiptoed around each other. I couldn't articulate what I was feeling. Part of me replayed the kiss in my mind over and over, haunted by the sensation of her lips on mine. Another part was angry. Maybe at her, maybe at myself, for making everything so complicated. Mostly, I felt paralyzed by the fear of change, as though acknowledging the kiss would be the same as admitting to something I wasn't ready to confront. Meanwhile, Olivia tried to reach out. She'd text me while we were both under the same roof. "Are we going to talk about this?" I'd respond with non-committal excuses. "Not now, I have a paper due," or "I need to clear my head." Even though I knew the tension only grew worse each time I avoided her. I sought refuge in the NYU library, hoping that the sterile quiet and the towering stacks of books would provide some escape. But no matter how many assignments I piled on my desk, no matter how intently I tried to focus on my graphic design projects, my mind drifted back to Olivia and the look in her eyes after she kissed me. One afternoon, frustration bubbled to the surface. Gathering my courage, I went back to the apartment early, determined to address everything head-on. Olivia was sitting at the small dining table we seldom used, flipping through a magazine and sipping tea. The moment I walked in, she tensed, like a startled cat. "Hey," she ventured. "Hi," I replied, standing a few feet away, hands clenched into fists at my sides. An uncomfortable beat passed before I blurted, "We need to talk." She gestured for me to sit across from her, which I did, though my muscles felt wound tight, like I was preparing for a confrontation. "What was that kiss about?" I asked, my voice low, wary. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry for the way I handled it, but I've been feeling something for a while now. Something more than friendship. And I needed to show you. I didn't think you'd ever notice if I didn't do something drastic." A pang shot through my chest. I'd known it on some level, of course, but hearing it stated so plainly felt both terrifying and somehow validating. "So you like me," I whispered, as if saying it too loudly would make it implode. She nodded, eyes full of anxiety. "I do." I didn't know what to say. The words seemed to get stuck in my throat. My heart pounded, but it was a mix of fear and something else. There was a part of me that wanted to shout, "I think I might feel the same way." But that same fear, the fear of losing our friendship, of challenging my own identity, kept me silent. After a moment, I mumbled, "I don't know if I can handle this right now," and fled into my room. I pressed my forehead against the closed door, cursing myself for my cowardice, for my lack of clarity. Outside, I could hear Olivia exhale shakily, and then the slight rustle of her magazine as she tried to pretend she was reading again. But the weight of that conversation hung in the air, unspoken words trailing me like ghosts. In the days that followed, I ventured deeper into my own thoughts. Late nights found me wandering the city, trying to escape the suffocating tension in the apartment. I'd ride the subway aimlessly, get off at random stops in Manhattan, or walk through Union Square observing street performers and late-shift workers scurrying to catch trains. No matter how far I went, the memory of that kiss and Olivia's vulnerable admission kept tugging at me. Eventually, I recognized that what frightened me the most wasn't her feelings, it was my own. Because if I allowed myself to reciprocate, it meant peeling back layers of denial I'd carefully assembled over the years. It meant confronting who I really was and who I might become if I allowed myself to be honest. Avoiding Olivia was like trying to sidestep a shadow on a bright day. Inevitable. After a week of terse interactions, the air in our apartment felt stale with tension, as though no amount of open windows could clear it. I had to confront her, or at least confront myself, before our carefully built life collapsed entirely. One quiet evening, I mustered the courage to knock on her bedroom door. My hand shook as I rapped softly on the wood. "Come in," she said. I opened the door, finding her seated on the edge of her bed, reading, or pretending to. Her hair fell in loose waves around her face, and she wore an oversized sweater that made her look smaller, more vulnerable. I hovered in the doorway, heart hammering. Can we talk?" She closed her book carefully, placing it on the bedside table. Yeah, of course. Crossing the room felt like traversing a canyon. I sank onto her desk chair, turning it so that I faced her. The silence stretched, thick with words unspoken, until finally I said, I don't want to pretend that kiss never happened, but I don't know what to do about it. Olivia's eyes reflected a swirl of emotions. Hope, fear, longing. I've been waiting for you to say something, she confessed, voice trembling ever so slightly. I'm sorry for how I sprang it on you, but if you give me a chance, if you let me in, I promise I'll be patient. I know you're scared. The sincerity in her words, and the gentleness with which she spoke them, dissolved some of my defenses. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, though I tried to blink them away. I'm not just scared of you, I admitted. I'm scared of me, of what this means for my future, for everything. I don't want to lose our friendship if this goes wrong. She reached out, hesitating before gently placing her hand over mine. I know, but some things are worth the risk, right? I stared at her hand. Warmth seeped into my skin where our palms touched. My mind flashed back to the countless moments over the last year when I'd felt inexplicably comforted by her presence. In that flash of memory, I realized that my fear of losing her was directly tied to how much she meant to me, and perhaps always had. I think you might be right, I said, voice hushed. We spoke for hours that night, unraveling pieces of our mutual confusion. I confessed to the fluttering in my stomach I'd felt around her, the conflicting emotions I'd tried to bury for so long. She told me about how she had suspected for months that we shared a deeper connection, but hadn't known how to approach me. By the time the conversation ended, dawn was a faint glow at the edges of the sky, and both of us were bleary-eyed from fatigue. Yet, for the first time in weeks, I felt the tension inside me begin to ease. At some point, she slipped her fingers through mine. The simple gesture felt infinitely more intimate than the impromptu kiss we'd shared. It was a conscious choice, a slow acceptance of what might happen next. We didn't label it. We didn't talk about being girlfriends or partners. We just held on to each other, quietly acknowledging the new territory we were stepping into. That night, I slept better than I had in a long time. I wasn't naive enough to think everything was magically resolved. I knew there would be challenges, conversations with friends, with family, and with myself. But at least we were finally on the same page, facing the uncertainty together. For a blissful few days, we found a sort of rhythm in our tentative new connection. We'd steal moments in the kitchen, brushing against each other as we cooked. We'd watch movies on the couch, aware of a heightened intimacy in the way we sat closer, the way her knee might press against mine. It felt both exhilarating and tender, like unwrapping a present you'd been anticipating for years. But life seldom hands out neat, happy endings without a test. Mine came in the form of a phone call from my father one crisp, overcast morning. I was in the living room, sketches spread out on the coffee table while Olivia was in her room painting. My phone buzzed and I answered without glancing at the caller ID, expecting maybe a friend or a classmate. Instead, I heard my dad's familiar voice. "How's school?" he asked after the usual pleasantries. "Any new developments?" I hesitated. My parents and I had never been openly confrontational. We were the kind of family that sidestepped difficult topics, preferring to maintain the illusion of harmony. I wasn't sure how to bring up the fact that I was seeing my roommate, my friend, another woman. It felt like a gulf between us, and I wondered if he sensed the subtle tension in my voice. I tried to keep the conversation light, talking about my graphic design classes, upcoming projects, anything but my personal life. But then, unexpectedly, he said, "I heard from someone, maybe a distant cousin, I'm not sure, that you and your roommate, are you two more than friends?" My heart lurched. My father had always been a figure of quiet authority, the one whose approval I had sought more intensely than anyone else's. I swallowed, feeling my stomach churn. "What exactly did you hear?" He paused, and in that long silence, I felt my pulse throb in my ears. "That you two might be involved," he said, carefully choosing his words. "I just want to make sure you're okay. You know your mother and I have certain expectations, but we don't want you making any rash decisions you'll regret." Disappointment and a flicker of anger swelled in my chest. I knew it was disguised as concern, but behind those measured words, I felt the judgment. It clashed so violently with the gentle, hopeful world I'd been building with Olivia that tears pricked at my eyes. "I'm fine," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what rumors you're hearing, but I have everything under control." We exchanged more pleasantries, though the tension was palpable. He ended the call with a reminder that the family was there if I needed them, but I sensed a barrier had arisen between us, one that wouldn't vanish easily. I sat on the couch, phone resting in my lap, struggling to steady my breathing. I was angry at him, at the intrusion of disapproval into a life that finally felt like it was becoming authentically mine. At the same time, I was terrified of severing ties with my family, of losing that sense of belonging I'd taken for granted. Olivia, sensing something was wrong, emerged from her room. "Everything okay?" she asked gently, taking in my pale complexion and the tears I was trying to blink away. I could only shake my head, feeling a lump in my throat. She crossed the room and sank down beside me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders. I melted into her embrace, relief and dread swirling within me. It felt like a pivotal moment. We could either shrink away from the world's scrutiny or fight for what was growing between us. "I'm here," she whispered, stroking my hair. And in that simple statement, I felt a surge of warmth, a reminder of why I had taken this step in the first place. But I also understood that this was only the beginning of a larger conflict, one that involved not just my relationship with Olivia, but my relationship with my family and ultimately with myself. In the weeks that followed, the slow dance between me and Olivia took on a new complexity. We were no longer just exploring each other's feelings. We were also grappling with how to integrate this new reality into the rest of our lives. On campus, we navigated stares and whispers from acquaintances who noticed a shift in how we interacted. Many of our close friends were supportive. Some seemed almost gleeful that we'd finally admitted what they'd suspected for a long time. A few were more reserved, offering cautious smiles or polite indifference. At home, we found a fragile equilibrium. We still watched movies together, cooked meals side by side, and shared late-night conversations about the future, my design ambitions and her artistic dreams. But beneath it all, I could sense my anxiety simmering. What will happen if my parents don't accept this? If I end up having to choose between them and the woman I'm growing to care so deeply about? Olivia never pressured me. She gave me space to process, comforting me when I needed it and backing off when I grew overwhelmed. Her patience felt like a steady flame in an otherwise stormy sea. I realized that if love meant something, it had to involve patience and understanding, not just passion. And despite everything, it felt like we were building something sturdy. Eventually, I mustered the courage to call my father again. The conversation was as difficult as I'd expected. There were tears on both ends, long silences, and attempts at reassurance. I told him that I was serious about figuring out who I was, that Olivia was important to me, and that I wanted their acceptance. He didn't yell or hang up, but neither did he embrace my words wholeheartedly. Instead, he told me to be careful and reminded me how different life might become. We ended the call on a cautious note. No grand reconciliations, but no irrevocable breaks either. After hanging up, I felt a sense of cautious relief. Maybe acceptance wouldn't come overnight, but it didn't have to be all or nothing. People can grow, and relationships can adapt if given enough time and understanding. Throughout this emotional tempest, Olivia remained my constant. We began to date in a more official sense, though official was still a bit of a foreign concept. Sometimes we'd go to dinner in Manhattan, wandering through the streets afterward hand in hand, occasionally stepping into a small bar to catch live music. Our closeness felt new, but also oddly natural, as if we'd been practicing for this step for far longer than we realized. On an early winter evening, as we sat side by side on a bench in Brooklyn Bridge Park, the skyline of Manhattan twinkling across the water, I found myself overcome by gratitude. The cold air prickled my cheeks, and Olivia's fingers were entwined with mine, her warm breath visible in the crisp air. I turned to her, heart swelling, and said, "I'm really glad we decided to do this." She squeezed my hand, her eyes shining. "I am too." In that moment, the complexities of life, my parents' hesitations, the pressures of school, the anxiety of stepping into a world that can be unforgiving, didn't vanish, but they shrank enough for me to remember what was most important. We were together, forging a path that felt more authentic and more meaningful than anything I'd pursued before. Looking back, I can see the precise instant things shifted. The night Olivia kissed me. It would have been easy to dismiss that moment as a mistake, to bury the feelings it unleashed and carry on as if nothing had happened. But something about the way her lips felt against mine told me that ignoring it would be more painful than facing it head-on. So, did I make the right choice by not running away from the fear? I still ask myself that sometimes, especially when life feels uncertain or when family tensions flare up again. But each time, I come to the same conclusion. Yes. Because in spite of the challenges, in spite of the occasional pang of regret or guilt, this step toward authenticity has allowed me to grow and to love more deeply than I ever thought possible. And now I pose the question to you, the reader. If you were in my place, would you have found the courage to follow your heart, even when fear lurked around every corner? I hope so. Because sometimes the scariest leaps lead to the truest forms of happiness.